when my class entered West Point in June of '64, or I guess it was the 1st of July of '64, Vietnam wasn't even on anybody's map. Nobody was talking about it. There was just a small advisory contingent in Vietnam at that point, working with the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army,
Right.
and it wasn't a word that we heard, nor was it a place we probably could have found on a map. And then, oh geez, I guess probably my first year there, my plebe year there, they began to bring guys back to bury in the West Point Cemetery. It began to sink in that there was a shooting war somewhere. And we probably, oh, I don't know, just a few announcements that year, maybe 4 or 5, I don't really remember. But it began to strike a note with us. And then as the years progressed at West Point, of course, the burials continued. And it was probably the beginning of our junior year. At the beginning of our junior year, we had to swear another oath that we would go through the graduation and serve 5 years active duty in the Army. Once you did that, you were committed. And if you got booted out or flunked out or whatever during the last 2 years, then you went in the Army as an E4 or E5, and normally they shipped you right off to Southeast Asia. So there was a lot of thought, I think, on the part of a lot of guys when that crunch point came in, because it was becoming obvious to us then, knowing what was going on a rather limited scale. I think we all began to appreciate the fact that we were, in fact, a war class.
Did you fly one of these commercial flights to South Vietnam?
Yeah.
So when you get on that plane, when you board that plane, and I imagine you've got some stops before you get to South Vietnam, but when you board that plane stateside, what did the war mean to you at that time? What were, as far as your own thinking went at that moment, what was the war about?
The war for me, and I guess probably most people in those days, was basically being fought to try to guarantee the South Vietnamese to choose their own future, to protect their government. You can't certainly call it a democracy, but in broad terms, there wasn't a communist country.
Right.
But to protect their right to choose their own way forward. And certainly it became a proxy war again, between us and Chinese and the Russians. But that figured in while I was there. All of a sudden, that hit me one day. And so I thought I was going off to do God's work. I thought I was going off to do what professional soldiers in the U.S. Army and West Point graduates needed to do, which was to go off and serve their country and lead soldiers in combat.
You said just a second ago that at a certain moment in South Vietnam, it occurred to you that, the Vietnam, whatever it was, and it certainly was a struggle against communism, there's no question about that, I don't think. But it was also a proxy war. What was it that brought that to your attention, or that brought that to your mind, that Vietnam was a proxy war between greater powers, the United States and China in this case?
A really bad night on a fire base when we almost lost it. We were almost totally overrun. And when the sun came up and the bad guys were trying to E&E out of the fire base and back into the jungle, I was a recon platoon leader at that point. My unit was the only one that was still in pretty good shape. The line company that was providing security that night had been pretty well beat up. And so I was asked if I would do a sweep outside of between our bunkers and the first line of concertina fence, and there were normally 3 of those. Right? But just to see if there was anybody still working close by on the other side of our sandbag walls or bunkers or whatever.
Yeah.
And we got to a point where I'd had a little go around that night and established later on as a command group for the sapper battalion that hit us. And I had a party with those guys at one point. And when we ran around the next morning, there was most of the staffers were typical little Oriental guys. They were small by design, so they could get through our wire and snake under and do that kind of stuff.
Wow.
But there was one big guy there that I figured I had to kill that night. And he was a big, muscular guy, looked like he worked out with weights, one of those type of guys, much taller than the bodies around him. And big enough to really have an impact and say, who in the hell is he and where did he come from? Now, later on that morning, we managed to snatch a POW who was hiding up under the bed of a 5-ton truck.
Yeah.
And when he came out in the initial interrogation on on the fire base before he was evac back to the division rear, I reported into the battalion S3 and the CO that there was this strange guy lying dead that certainly didn't look like a Vietnamese. And they confirmed in the initial interrogation that he was a communist Chinese advisor and maybe even the commander of that particular attack.
So let's get back on that plane. You haven't set foot yet in South Vietnam. You're on the plane. What memories do you have of that? I've spoken with some of the flight attendants who served on those planes. It's very interesting discussions. What recollections do you have, if any? Some vets don't have really any recollections of it, but what recollections do you have of the flight that eventually get you to South Vietnam?
I was scared to death when I got on that airplane. I linked up with a couple of guys the night before, and we're going to war tomorrow, so let's go out and hang it all out tonight. And I got on the airplane. It was primarily filled with guys going for the first time. There were some guys on board who were going back for a second tour or a third tour. And those of us going for the first time, we went to war all by ourselves on an airplane with 220 people. I didn't know anybody. I don't know what happened to the guys I was drinking with the night before. I have no recollection of. I'm sure they were on the airplane. I have no recollection of the interface with them. I had a window seat, I remember, on the first leg of that flight, and you get the normal thoughts of some guys going off to war. Can I deal with this? Am I going to be a coward? How am I going to cope with this? How am I going to lead soldiers? Because we were all going as individual replacements. So as an infantry platoon leader, as a brand new guy, I was going to go take command of an infantry platoon of combat hardened and experienced soldiers. And who's this new guy to tell me what to do? And I remember just really thinking about that. Our first stop was in Hawaii to refuel. They may have let us off the airplane, but we were very tightly confined in the perimeter around the airplane.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the stewardesses at that point, all attractive young ladies who were very warm-hearted on that plane, who went out of their way to give guys anything that they could and try to make them comfortable, to talk with guys, because it got to be kind of boring during that long flight. I saw one holding the hand of some guy up a couple of rows ahead of me because he was obviously going through his mental turmoil, wasn't quite sure how he was going to do all that. And I think I remember getting off the airplane in Guam, which was our next refueling point, Anderson Air Force Base, which was full of B-52s, which were taking off as we were there. They let us off that airplane as well and kept us in a confined area while they refueled. Wow. And we saw B-52s taken off, and we thought, holy shit, we are going to get in the middle of a war. These guys are going off to go do their thing. So the last leg of that flight was very tense. Every orifice in your body just kind of clenches, and you have trouble breathing sometimes. Your head is filled with the normal thoughts of soldiers going off to combat. And I remember my one big fear. I had been gotten married about 5 months, I think, before I left. And my one big fear is what happens if I get burned? What happens if I come home disfigured? Will my wife still want me?
Wow.
I wasn't too concerned about losing an arm or a leg because that was a kind of common sight, and
Mm.
and I thought she'd probably come up with that. But at one point at West Point, I was in Walter Reed for some surgery, and my roommate was an F-4 pilot who had been shot down in flames, and they were basically reconstructing his face and the upper part of his body. He had a big glob of stuff with two straws in it to breathe. While he was there, he got his first weekend pass with his wife, and I remember him saying, "Hey, John, look at this," and he pulled a box out of a drawer that looked like a medal, an award box, right? And he opened that up, and then there were two ears, and he had little stubs on the side of his head, and he had some kind of adhesive that he could glue his ears on, so he looked a little.
Wow.
But still, in all, I mean, he was very disfigured with burns and so forth. So that struck a note with me.
Wow.
And I don't think anybody slept during that last leg. I mean, we were all realizing what we were going into, and everybody was anxious, scared. I mean, anyone that tells you he's not scared going into combat is either lying through his teeth.
Well, and you know that you're going into combat. I mean, you know that you're not going. You do spend the latter part of your tour in Vietnam in the rear, although not in a place of complete safety. But you know that you're going into a combat situation. So you've been sharing thoughts you had and ideas you had. Where did you land in South Vietnam?
We landed at Benoit Air Base, and we're bussed into Long Binh, which is the big Army logistics center outside of Saigon.
So you
where the 90th Replacement Battalion was.
Okay, so you land at Benoit. It's 1969. So you've been sharing these thoughts that you had on the plane, and those thoughts are associated with feelings. And what was the first thing you heard, saw, experienced that now took this out of the world of thought and made it concrete? You know that you're going to a war zone, but now I've just seen something, I've heard something, I've experienced something that has absolutely driven it home. This is a war zone. What was the first thing that you recall?
Well, the pilot came on the intercom 10 minutes out, maybe, and alerted us to the fact that we were going into a very steep spiral for landing to try to minimize his exposure to ground fire.
Wow.
And he asked us to get off his airplane as quickly as we could because he had to reload with a bunch of guys going home and take off. So we all kind of stood up and were headed for the door, and we landed on my birthday, on my 24th birthday.
Was there a flight attendant at the door as you're walking out?
Matter of fact, the whole crew of flight attendants were lined up by the door, shaking our hands, giving us hugs, wishes of "I'll see you a year from now," "Good luck,"
Wow.
"I'll pray for you," that kind of thing. They were very warm. They were obviously emotionally upset because they knew what most of us were going into.
Sure. You're going to Vietnam knowing that you're going into combat, but you're not going as a private. You have the additional burden of knowing that you're going to be leading soldiers in combat. And not only are you going to be, you're not going to be leading new soldiers in combat, though. You're going to be joining, as you said a few minutes ago, soldiers who are younger than I am, are much lower rank than I, but who have significantly more combat experience. There's a lot for a 24-year-old young man to be stressed out about as you're heading into this situation. What was your approach to this? Because you go into your unit, and we'll hear a little bit more about your unit in a little bit, but you go into your unit as the new guy, but you're the new guy in charge. And a good number of the guys under your command are experienced combat vets. What was your approach to, sort of working yourself into that system?
Sure. I have very clear memories of my first day in the battalion. After I got through, the division had a school 4 or 5 days that we went to before we went down to our battalions to brief us on what the division tactical operation plans were, what the SOPs were. We got a real heavy refresher in battlefield medical care. We spent a lot of time on the range with M16s, and in my case, also 45 to qualify
Mm.
to make sure that we were ready. And then we went to the battalion, and I don't remember when I was told which battalion I was going to. It must have been probably the last day of that orientation course that I was going to go to the First Battalion, 14th Infantry. Okay, and they put me on an airplane, and they flew me up to Pleiku Air Force Base.
Mm.
And Pleiku was the side of the division rear at that time. And so I'm sitting in the back of a C-130 with all the smells and noises and so forth associated with the back of that airplane. No pretty young ladies on board this one. Holes that sunlight streaming through, thinking about just your question, how am I going to deal with this? And I thought probably a subconscious thought was that, well, I've been through more than 4 years of training. It's now a personal thing for me. Am I going to be able to cope with it, or am I not? There were guys and infantry officers couldn't cope with the responsibilities of leadership who very quickly left a combat battalion and wound up permanently in the rear doing things back there. And so the day came, I think I spent one night in the battalion rear Camp Anari, where I ended the process of the battalion, and I was told what my assignment was be. I was going to go to Charlie Company, 1st and the 14th. Okay, they just had a platoon leader killed, my predecessor. And I was going by convoy the next morning. And since I was the only officer, I was going to be the convoy commander.
Wow.
Whoa, okay. Well, what do? You do what you got to do, right? You do what you're trained to do. You follow your instincts in your training. And I found for me, I adapted to that challenge just based on instincts of leadership, I think, and the training that I had that was pretty good. Although I was, again, I was scared shitless when it came time to. I think I had 5 trucks in that convoy, deuce and a half, filled with people and equipment going out to the fire base, and we had a little formation where the headquarters commandant briefed me on what was in the trucks, how many people I had, the fact they assigned me an RTO with a radio so I could communicate with either him or the fire base. And told me I was going to go about 20 kilometers, 25 kilometers to the fire base. Okay. So I had time to board the trucks, and I'm trying to be now Mr. John Wayne, West Point graduate combat commander, and not some wet behind the ears little slicky. I was a first lieutenant, fortunately. I've been promoted, not a second lieutenant. And so we got onto the trucks, and all of a sudden the NCOIC of the rear area is yelling at me, Lieutenant, Lieutenant. Looked out the window. He's holding up my 2 bandoliers of ammunition for my M16.
Oh, wow.
And he says, how in the hell are you going to fight a war if you can't never take your bullets with you?
So your very first day, your leading NCOs reminding you need bullets because we're in a war.
Yeah. And so here's all these soldiers laughing at me, of course. Typical new guy. Well, the first thing I've got to do is I've got to meet my NCOs. These guys are critical to not only my success, but safeguarding the lives of the soldiers here while I'm kind of working myself into this.
Sure.
So I called a meeting with my squad leaders. Platoon sergeant was just going to talk with them, getting to know their names. RTO came over and had gotten a call on the radio. CO wants you up at the CP. So I went up and I was told that I was going to take my platoon and load them on trucks, and I'm going about another 20 kilometers down the highway to secure a village that had been hit by probably the Viet Cong the night before.
Mm.
My first day in the battalion, my first hour or two on the fire base, and I'm already leaving with some 30 combat hardened soldiers going out to Indian country.
Now, did you say that your predecessor had been killed in action?
Yeah.
I've talked to other young officers who said that when they came into that situation, that made it a little bit harder because this new guy is not only the new guy, and we're not sure about this new guy, but this new guy or this new commander also reminds us of the previous one who was killed in combat. And that made the transition maybe a little more difficult at the outset. Was that the case for you, do you think?
I think so. I sense obviously a loyalty on the part of my guys to the guy who had been killed, and he'd been killed, I think maybe a month before I got there, and they'd been without an officer. All that.
Wow, just the NCOs had been running things?
Yeah, the platoon sergeant was running the operation. He was very happy to see me.
To hand that responsibility off.
Yeah, yeah. I found out very quick that first night in a little perimeter beside a Mountain Yard village in the central highlands of South Vietnam, trying to set up a defensive perimeter for the night, that the responsibility for safeguarding the lives of a lot of mothers' sons is the heaviest friggin' responsibility any man can ever experience, and particularly small unit. I mean, those were my guys. That was it. Probably up through company, you have that kind of a feel of responsibility because all those guys' lives depend on decisions you make and what you do. I remembered all I'd been taught, how to set up fields of fire and how to lay in final protective fires, and we put out drip flares and mines, and I made sure I did my check of the perimeter before I went back to my established CP in the middle of the perimeter. And I had my platoon sergeant with me this whole time, and I had told him, make sure I don't screw up there. Make sure that what I do with these guys is the right thing to do. No matter how scared you are, you go out and do your job, and you don't let your soldiers see how you really feel. Sometimes after a pretty tough fight or something, they can probably tell. In my case, a lot of times afterwards, I tried to take a drink out of my canteen, and it was tough to do. The adrenaline drain would set in, or light a cigarette, and I couldn't. And that's the problem. That told me, holy shit, man, you were really tensed up with this or psyched up with this or whatever. And I mean, I didn't do a whole lot of deep soul searching introspection in Vietnam. There wasn't the time or I don't think the need to do that, but I examined myself from time to time. Okay, so I was scared. Well, what did I do? Where did I fail to do something because I was scared? The key factor for young lieutenants when they're out operating separately with their units is, can this guy read a map? Can he get us to where we need to go? Because training in Vietnam was horrible. I mean, we spent not so much with Charlie Company. We were in a relatively flat area before the mountains, but then you get into triple canopy jungle. You can't land dissociate with things around you because you can't see hills or whatever. You have to figure out a way to cope with that. Fortunately, I had always done well in map reading and compass courses and things like that, and in all the courses, all the schools we'd been to. So I had a degree of confidence in my ability to read a map, and it became really critical if you got into a fight, and then you had to call in artillery support or fast movers, air support, or whatever. You better know where the hell you are. And there are stories of young officers calling that crap in on their own position because they weren't sure where they were.
A lot of the photos that I've seen from your collection, you and the soldiers you're with are wearing red scarves. Um, what is the story behind the red scarves?
Okay. That was my second command in Vietnam. That was the Battalion Reconnaissance Platoon, uh, which was a select group of proven soldiers who could operate by ourselves uh, and be successful. And our mission was to go find the bad guys, not necessarily to fight them, although be able to do that if you had to, but be able to go find them. And sometimes that meant being way the hell out in front of other units and, 20, my normal field strength was 24,
Hmm.
and being able to count on those 24 guys to be able to do what they had to do. The Red Scarf was a Valor Award before I took over the platoon, so I had nothing to do with it. But it was a Valor Award given to that recon platoon by a South Vietnamese regional force, popular force type, RFPF recon platoon
Hmm.
that wore that red scarf as their unit identifier. They didn't wear patches necessarily, but that red scarf was denoted who they were. And there was a big fight shortly before I got there on a joint operation with my guys and this unit, where the Vietnamese were so impressed with how these Americans fought that at the end they had a ceremony and they awarded each American a red scarf.
Wow.
So, and they were worn 24/7 in jungles or wherever.
So even when going into a likely combat situation, still you're wearing the scarves. Wow.
It was kind of like, come get me if you can. There's some bravado that's needed.
Well, that's what I was going to wonder. Was there, I mean, because I'm guessing that it makes at least a little more likely that you'd be seen. So is that where the bravado is?
I mean, I found out afterwards, I don't remember when, but somewhere in this course of events of that year, that those red scarves had a $10,000 bounty on
Wow.
from the NVA local commanders. The scarf was was a very noticeable item that really bound us together in that recon. There wasn't another unit in the battalion that wore scarves or in the division that I know. And again, it was a form of bravado that it was worn even in the worst of times. And in the midst of areas where we knew there were all kinds of bad guys, we still wore those scarves.
Well, yeah, and some of your photos, I mean, guys are shirtless, but they've still got their scarves.
They got the scarf.
If the scarf,
and that is held over until today. We started reunions of this recon platoon in the year 2000. Every time we have a reunion, we got our red scarves on.
Wow.
I've buried 10 of my guys since that time,
Mm.
mostly due to Agent Orange originated cancers and other issues.
Right.
Every one of them has been buried with their red scarf.
Wow.
Even almost got into fisticuffs with one funeral director who said, "Nah, you can't get in there and put a red scarf on him. We don't do that." No. We convinced him that yes, we would either by his leave or through his leave, one way or the other.
Yeah.
The guy was not going to be buried without his red scarf. When I pull it out, I mean, it is my original. It brings back memories. I mean, it because all of a sudden there I am 52 years ago, 52 years. And I know that I wore it at the toughest times that I had over there when I, thought I was going to die. I had that on.
What was the work of these guys in the red scarves?
Well, like we were probably the most proficient small infantry unit in Vietnam. I mean, my guys walked through the jungle like Indians, okay? As a phrase, because you always see the Native Americans are sneaking through the woods, not making any noise and watching where they place their feet. We did that. We operated like that. My guys, particularly in the jungle, where it can be really noisy if you're not careful. My guys looked for every step. And And we didn't move very quickly, but we moved safely. I was never, ever ambushed. Um, and a lot of times we'd be sent out on a mission. Our major mission was to catch NVA coming out off the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the Central Highlands. And my battalion, 1st of the 14th, was centrally located and was the only U.S. infantry battalion in the area. So we had the mission of screening the border, let's say.
The border of, trying to remember which, would that be Cambodia or Laos there?
Cambodia.
Cambodia, yeah.
And the border is in a very mountainous area. So we spent a lot of time climbing mountains and whatever. But a lot of times our radios were primarily line of sight radios, PRC-25, even with a long antenna, we got a little bit more range. But I have been on operations where I had no communication with anybody. I had 2 RTOs in my command, in my CP. I had 1 on my internal frequency. Each one of them, I had 3 squads. Each one of them had a radio so I could communicate with the squad leaders. And I had another RTO who was on the battalion tactical frequency that we would use to call in air support, artillery support, or ground support. And there were times we had no commo with anybody. Scary, scary situation, because you think, holy mackerel, if I run into a whole nest of these guys, how do I call for extraction? How do I call for fire support? How do I get gunships? So the Air Force in here to break contact. And that was not unusual. It was not unusual at times we did have contact to be beyond the range of our direct support artillery battery, so that they couldn't support me if I needed them. And I was then dependent on bigger guns at higher echelons in the artillery organization, 8-inch or 175s, if I could get to them through the artillery liaison officer at my battalion headquarters, to get fire support from those guys. We all depended on each other to get us through the day. I depended on the guys who were walking point for me. I depended on them to keep me out of trouble. I normally had, if the terrain allowed or vegetation allowed, I had guys out on my flanks too. Maybe not too far, maybe 10 meters or so, depending on how thick the vegetation was, to provide security for me and early warning of ambush sites or whatever. And I had a little detachment of 2 or 3 guys that were trailing us and behind us to make sure that no one was following us. And I mean, there were some lonely nights. You know, if you had, I mean, a lot of people will tell you that, you know, Vietnam was 99% boredom and 1% of absolute sheer terror. For us, it was a little more than 1%, because we normally had something to do every time we went out.
You mentioned a Montagnard village. I think your first night of, you know, really being with the guys in country in a Montagnard village. You're in the Central Highlands, of course, that we associate with the Montagnards, and then I've seen some of your photos there. Did you have Montagnard troops with you? Did you do any operations with Montagnard fighters?
Yeah, from time to time. Not the norm, because we were normally on our own, and the yards, affectionately called yards, that's not a negative term. But the yards, of course, weren't up to speed on tactics or immediate reaction drills and that kind of thing. But there were some times where I would get a couple of yards out of the village to guide me to my next objective, the next place I wanted to be, to make sure I could get there, particularly in tough terrain and jungles when land navigation is really, really tough. The NVA, a different breed of cat. They were hardcore professional soldiers. They had a hardcore professional chain of command, NCOs and officers. And where if we had a chance meeting engagement with a VC unit after the initial exchange of fire, they'd melt away and disappear on us. NVA, if they thought they were if they thought they had the ability to take on whatever American unit they encountered, would stay and fight. And their way of combating our ability to use air support and artillery support was to get as close to us as they could. It was kind of go grab the American soldiers by the belt.
That's what I was gonna. Yeah, it's General Yap's thing. Grab the enemy by the belt, get as close as you can, and.
Yep, and that's what they tried to do.
Did you know that at the time that this was the tactic of theirs to get as close as possible?
I mean, that word spread pretty well. Maybe even during the division orientation, when we were briefed on what the enemy forces were likely to be, there was a great deal of respect for NVA.
There's just one thing I wanted to ask about, and it's this sentence. So I'm coming right into the middle of the sentence, and you say, "I took my first aimed shot at another human being. He went down," and he was an NVA soldier. So you're describing that first moment, that first instance of knowing that you had just, pulled the trigger, and another human being, an enemy, had gone down. And I want to ask you about how that experience lives with you. But let me set it up this way. Recently had a discussion with a guy, a Navy guy who worked with ground support. So he's sending shells from his ship inland, and will get reports, good job, you're right on target. But it's an abstraction to him. He doesn't, he doesn't know. He certainly doesn't have the certainty and the clarity that you do. You mentioned some time back these B-52s flying out of Guam, and you know that they're heading to Vietnam, and that's going to have an impact on people on the ground. But these B-52 pilots are so far up, it's kind of an abstraction to them. What you just described is not an abstraction. You point the weapon, you pull the trigger, the enemy goes down. And so here I'm asking you to reflect as a combat veteran, and a lot of folks hearing you won't have any idea what combat is like, but how does that experience live with you, even as you wrote that down? What sorts of things go through your mind? What sorts of sensations do you have? How does that memory have its own sort of existence in conjunction with yours?
I can remember that like it was yesterday. I don't remember a lot of the other guys I killed that I know I did, but that guy I remember. Think of what the culture in this country was like in the 50s and 60s. In a stable home environments, normally everybody went to church on Sundays. You went to Sunday school class, you served as altar servers or whatever in the church, and you learned the Ten Commandments, right? And thou shalt not kill. And all through the training, we were always told that that's our mission, to close with and destroy the enemy. And destroy means to kill, and you need to come to terms with that. And so I didn't think any. I said, sure, oh, absolutely, man. That's gonna be no sweat. And if I see a bad guy trying to kill me, if I get him first, all right. But I remember the first guy. It was a weird situation in that we were checking out a cave behind a waterfall that turned out to be an NVA hospital. So most of my guys were down below, but I had taken one squad and we had climbed up this rocky cliff face to put them up on security up on the top of that particular cliff for early warning, because there were signs like that hospital had been recently used and there was a caretaker force in there. I mean, who knew what was there? And so there's a humorous story with this. I've got them in place. I went back down. One of the guys called me and said, "Hey, you need to come see this." And we kind of walked along a little ledge on the face of the cliff behind the water, and there was a big opening. And into there we went. We found
You found a whole hospital down there.
Yeah, operating rooms, wards, mess hall. It was phenomenal. All kinds of. I don't want to get gory, but obviously it's been recently used, and some footlockers. And so he dragged the footlocker out to see, because there's maybe some good intel in that footlocker. Footlocker out. Imagine taking it down this lock face wall with a footlocker with a couple of guys trying to make sure it doesn't throw you off balance and knock you down. Got it down the bottom. We opened it up, and at least the top level of that footlocker was nothing but sexy black female underwear. Nurses, maybe, I don't know.
Oh, either that or the NBA soldiers had something weird going on, but
yeah. So I gave a pair of that. My battalion commander was with me that day. He was out on that operation. And so I grabbed a pair of the panties and I gave it to him. I said, "So just remember, this was the first time you ever went out on a mission with me." So anyway, and about that time, as I handed him the panties, he's looking at me like, "What am I going to do with these?" All hell breaks loose up on top of the cliff.
Oh boy!
I hear I had an M60 machine gun up there, a couple of M79 squatter soldiers, confused M16s, and the world erupts. And oh my God Almighty! And you don't think that's an immediate reaction inbred in you. I slung my weapon over my back because I wanted both hands to claw my way up that face with a couple other of my guys. And I thought I was the heat, the tension, the adrenaline pumping. Boy, I didn't know if I was going to make it to the top. Well, I did. And you pause at first and some kind of cover and concealment. You look around trying to figure out what's going on and tell where the firing was coming from. It wasn't far away. And as I looked, a guy popped up out of the shrubbery, maybe, I don't know, 30 meters, 40 meters from me. And he was drawing a bead on one of my guys. So my immediate reaction, and I was a good shot. And my immediate reaction is, I got to take this guy down. I didn't think that consciously.
Right.
Subconsciously, I know I needed to do that. And I hit him in the head, and I remember that exploding like a pumpkin. Right? And at that point, I didn't think much of it because my guys were in trouble, and I had to go do what I had to do. And we fortunately got out of that without any casualties on our side. And we went to police up the battlefield afterwards to see if we could intel, and that guy wasn't there anymore. He'd been dragged away. They were NVA, because NVA had soldiers equipped with ropes and grappling hooks. And they would throw the grappling hook at a body and drag it off the battlefield because they knew our success was based on body count. And if we couldn't get a true body count, then maybe we weren't being successful to our operation. So I found the blood trail, and I knew where he had been, but they dragged him off. So we never could check him out. But and I thought, I mean, that hit me. As I made sure my guys were okay, I grabbed my squad leader and shoot his ass, because my machine gunner, when I finally got to where all the shit was happening, stark ass naked in the middle of the stream, did you think in a bath? Big guy.
Describe that.
And bodybuilder type with his M60, hosing down the brush. And I mean, it's comical when you think about it. It's almost enough to laugh. And his assistant gunner was
not at the moment, though.
But I chewed out my squad leader for allowing that to happen. And I made my way back down that cliff, and I went to sit down. It's the first time I had the symptoms I described the year before. The impact of the suddenness of the combat, the vision of that guy's head exploding. I mean, I knew I'd killed another human being without any doubt. All hit me. I was brought up, in a church-going family. And even though certainly in war, the rules are different, but still, I had taken the life of another human being. I was so concerned about taking care of my mother's sons. I didn't think about it at that time, but afterward, I thought, what about his mom? What about his wife and kids if he had any? And that has stuck with me. Sadness that I ended those lives. I look at my guys when we do reunions, and now our kids have kids. We got 3 generations that show up to me. And I look at these guys, and we're all old and fat and bald headed, and we're not the hard charging young hardcore soldiers that we used to be. But everybody's had such a great life. And I think of my guys from over there who didn't have that opportunity. And I also think about the guys that I was responsible for killing, because I mean, there were times when we always policed the battlefield before we left. Again, looking for intel. That was SOP. You go up and find the bodies, and you search the bodies, pockets, whatever, or web gear for maps, for notebooks with writing, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
So I know we killed a bunch, and it really came home to me a few years ago when I had a reunion at my house. And guys came in with their families. We had our red scarves on, of course, the whole time. And I'm out riding around with one of the guys who was a sniper. I'd sent him back to sniper school in Division Rear, and he came back after training with a match grade M14 that fired match grade ammo that he wasn't allowed to disassemble. All he could do was run attachment. And we're just talking about things, and all of a sudden I hear him crying. And I looked over at him and said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "The memories that I've carried all these years, because with a sniper weapon, it has a scope on it, and you get up close and personal with the guy that you're pulling the trigger. You see his facial features. I mean, it's much closer than the normal range of combat." And he said, I keep seeing those faces. I just keep seeing those faces. And he was crying in the car, had me going too, because I said, "Look, for all those guys you killed, that's not you. That's my responsibility, because I told you to do that. Don't carry that burden on yourself. That's my burden for having asked you to, or told you to do that. So, put it on me, man. Don't carry it yourself." And that just sticks, even 53 years later.
What's going through my mind as I listen to you, I think you used the verb carry 3 times, and there's that phrase, the things they carry, the Vietnam vets, and the things they carry in war, in the context of war, the tremendous weight that you've got to carry, the food and the sea rations and the water and the ammo and the weapons and everything else, and then the things you carry after the war. And you've talked about carrying these memories, and I think conflict among human beings is about the most ancient thing that we've got. You read the most ancient literature we have, and conflict is right there at the outset. And there are those among us who bear the burden of that. And so that's one of the things I'm thinking as I hear you speak. And I'm also thinking of that term, that idea of military service. And there's military service such as I had, which lasted 4 years, and I have some memories and had an impact on me, but nothing, I mean, absolutely nothing like what you've been describing. But the combat veteran, it seems, based on what I'm hearing you say, that the military service goes on. I mean, it doesn't stop. In some sense, the service to the country, the sacrifice, carries on because of these memories that are going to be with you to the end.
I'm very proud of serving my country, and serving my country in combat if that's what the country required me to do. I would do it all again tomorrow if I were physically capable. It's weird. People say, "How can you say that?" And I said, "Well, think for a minute. I can't conceive of being a surgeon and putting a scalpel in another human being's body and cutting him open. I don't know how anybody does that. Or I don't know how people are dentists and take a drill and drill in someone's tooth and inflict pain and discomfort. How does he do that day after day after day after day?" I was a professional soldier. In Vietnam, I was doing what I was trained to do. And I was fairly successful at what I did. Um, Looking back and listening to my guys, I think I was what I wanted to be. You know, I wanted to be good at what I did, but take care of my guys at the same